I've come to you this morning from a little place to talk to you about a great thing. And that is what you should do when God asks for the unimaginable. When God asks you for the unimaginable. And the unimaginable may be varied things. It could be something as simple as being asked to be kind to someone who is dragging your name through the mud. The unimaginable can be something like being asked to stay faithful in a marriage to a spouse who is not being faithful. It can feel unimaginable if God were to ask you to keep hoping in Him when you have a loved one who seems to be racing farther and farther into rebellion. It can feel unimaginable to take a stand for God when you know that this will likely mean for you a loss of friends. It can even feel unimaginable to be asked by God to serve in a way that feels really overwhelming given your present strength and giftedness. I would guess that some of you, even now, are facing the unimaginable. And if you're not facing that right now, I just want you to understand someday soon you will be. Peter said that every single Christian is going to face unimaginable hardships that will test whether your faith and my faith in God are genuine or not. Well, Father Abraham faced an extreme version of this kind of test. And you can see this if you're already open to Genesis 22. Right there in verse 1, this is a test. I'm going to read to you Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14. And while I do, I want you to try to imagine being asked this from God. Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Let us start out in this passage with something that we know that Abraham doesn't know. And that is, we are told in verse 1, this is a test. Some of y'all will be old enough, like me, to recognize that phrase, this is a test. And y'all know the sound that went along with those words, This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. Abraham doesn't know it, but we do. We know it because we heard that noise when we weren't in an emergency, so that we might get ready for when we were in an emergency. God is asking Abraham for the unimaginable, to sacrifice his son. And you should know right now, he's never, be comforted, he will never ask you to do anything to this degree. Abraham and Isaac are completely unique in the unfolding plan of God to bless the world. And so, Abraham has to prove something in his relationship to God by doing this very thing. But God will never ask this unimaginable thing of you. And yet, Abraham right here is a model, as the way the New Testament holds him out for us to watch, especially this event. He is a model for whenever and however God asks you to obey him and trust him in circumstances that at least seem unimaginable. And I want to tell you the main point of this sermon from this text. It comes especially at that high point in the text in chapter 22 and in verse 12. Here's the main point. Fear God more than you love anything else. When God asks you for the unimaginable, what you need to do is fear God more than you love anything else. Because when you come to that moment, that testing, you are going to be tempted right then to resist God. And so I want to lay out for you three things that Abraham did not do when his test came. And it showed that he feared God more than he loved anything else. The first thing is when God is asking something of you, don't wait. Don't wait. In the musical Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton and his wife at some point are working through the unimaginable. They're trying to save their marriage after an affair. And then on top of that, they are dealing with the death of their son. And this lyric comes in the musical. It says, if you see him in the streets, walking by himself and talking to himself, have pity. He is working through the unimaginable. Now, if Abraham, after getting this command in verse 2, took some time to work through the unimaginable, we would have pity. We would understand that. And that's not just because we live in a feelings-first culture. We would have pity on him. I mean, this is unimaginable, what he's being asked of God to do. And yet, it is interesting that God records nothing about Abraham working through his feelings. His feelings play no part in determining what he's going to do when God asks for the unimaginable. Abraham doesn't wait. I mean, that's immediately what he does. Look in verse 3. He's commanded this unimaginable thing in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning. He didn't sleep in. He doesn't wait for clarification. I mean, how can we slaughter Isaac? If you're familiar with the story of the Bible, this is the son that he and his wife had been waiting all their life for. How can you ask me to slaughter my son? He doesn't wait for clarification. He doesn't wait for counsel either. He doesn't go to Sarah. Sweetheart, what would you think when this is the unimaginable thing that we've been asked to do? And if you'll step back, I think this does make sense when we think about who Abraham is dealing with. I mean, you can maybe just imagine a scenario from the military. Imagine a commanding officer in war is commanding a soldier to advance and attack. And just imagine the soldier waiting. And waiting specifically to ask other soldiers, like, what they think about the order. Now, you don't know me at all, but let me tell you, I've never come anywhere near military service. This is the kind of guy I am. I've just never come near it, but I have watched lots of movies. And even I know that waiting, when that kind of order comes down, is what court-martials are for. Maybe the firing squad, that's what that's for. Abraham gets something that you need to get and I need to get when God's asking, even for the unimaginable, even for the thing that you feel like you have no strength to give, even in the most inopportune moment, when God is asking, he's not asking. And Abraham gets that, so he doesn't wait. First thing in the morning, he goes. He saddles his donkey, it says in verse 3. He takes 2 of his young men with him to help out. And the most important piece, he brings his son Isaac. Then he cuts the wood for the burnt offering. He goes to the place that God tells him to go. And on the third day, God shows to Abraham where he's supposed to be. Now, how is it that Abraham can do this without any kind of waiting? That's really hard for me to even imagine. But I bet the fact that God has already asked a lot of Abraham probably prepared him for this. If you remember back in chapter 12, God asked him, leave your hometown, leave all of your family, and go to a land you don't know for me, the God you just met. And if you remember, Abraham didn't wait. And just a few chapters later, this was something. God comes to him and he says, look, Abraham, I know you're 99 years old, but I'm going to ask you to get circumcised today. And you've got to convince all the men in your group that today's the day they got to get circumcised as well. And he did not wait. I just want to humbly, but I do want to seriously suggest to you that you should start now building reflexes of not waiting a single moment whenever God asks you for anything big or small. Because there's a day coming when God will ask you for the unimaginable, and you want to be practiced then. And yet, here we are with Abraham, and this ask, it feels like too much. It's amazing he doesn't wait. And be comforted that God is never going to ask you to do this thing, but he's going to ask you to do some things. And I will grant you, as a pastor who pastors people who are walking through these things, there are going to be times where you should seek clarification and you should seek counsel. But that's only to make sure you heard the ask clearly. Listen, once you've heard God ask you clearly, don't wait. Don't wait for anything. And I'll tell you that there are people who hear me saying these things, and you're right there with me. It's actually a common thing for followers of Jesus. Some people to be really quick to sign up when they haven't really counted the cost. We just think about the Apostle Peter as an example. Fast to obey, but struggle to follow through. And so there's a second thing I want you to know. Whenever God asks you for the unimaginable, don't withhold. Don't wait, and don't withhold. See, it's not enough that Abraham doesn't wait. I mean, immediately moving toward obedience, you got to do that. That's really commendable. But it's going to be a whole different matter altogether as Abraham's obedience keeps on getting tested. Like those days it took to get to the mountain. Like as he's climbing up the mountain. Like when he is having to tie down his own son. It appears that those two servants weren't there to give some distance between Abraham and the actual act. Abraham has to tie down his son on the altar and then give him up as a burnt offering. Now, the kind of sacrifice God is asking for really highlights the unimaginable. I know that this is a church full of maybe there's some homeschoolers up in here and some classically educated people up in here, and so maybe you're up to speed on all the different kinds of sacrifices offered up in the nation of Israel. But for those of you who are not caught up to speed, let me catch you up. The burnt offering is one where the worshiper lays the whole body of the sacrifice on the fire to be burned up from top to bottom, all the way down to ash. God is asking to smell the smoke of Abraham's son. He knows what he's asking. That's why he phrased it the way he did back in verse 2. Your son, your only son, the one you love. He's asking Abraham that, for the smoke to rise, in order to prove Abraham doesn't withhold anything from God. And that's what he wants us to feel. That Abraham would not withhold anything from God. That's why there's this repetition over and over in the passage. And in verse 6, there's highlighting the relationship. Isaac, his son, had the wood laid on his shoulders. In verse 7, Isaac speaks to his father. Abraham says, my father. And then Abraham's answer is, my son, here I am. He's emphasizing this in verse 8 when he says, my son, God is going to provide for you, or for us, this burnt offering. This is why it is repeated twice in this passage. And so, in that way, they went, both of them, together, to heighten the fact that he's asking him not to withhold even the one he loves. One thing that's amazing is not just that Isaac does, or that Abraham doesn't withhold anything. It's that Isaac can't withhold anything either. I mean, did you hear that? Isaac is being asked for the unimaginable. And when Abraham doesn't answer Isaac's question with any kind of clarity, when Isaac says, Father, I see the wood, and I see the fire, and I see your knife there. Where is this offering? Where's the offering? And Abraham just says, well, the Lord will provide. Isaac doesn't withhold. And this gives us a really valuable lesson. When God asks you for the unimaginable, don't withhold full obedience until you get a full picture. He doesn't wait. He doesn't withhold. And there's no record, even from then on, that Isaac would resist or that he would struggle against anything. There's no record whatsoever of either one of them withholding. It's highlighted here in verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there. And then he laid the wood in order, and then he took his son, and he bound Isaac, his own son, laid him on that altar, on top of the wood, and then it's time. Abraham reaches out his hand, takes the knife to slaughter his son. What the text tells us is when it mattered most, Abraham feared God more than he loved Isaac. And when it mattered most, Isaac feared God more than he loved life. The next time God asks you to do something that feels just unimaginably hard, you would be really wise to stop right there and ask yourself, what is it right now that I'm afraid to lose? Why does this feel so unimaginable? It's because you're afraid to lose something. And Whatever your answer is to that question, that's the test. It's whether you're going to fear God more than you love that thing that you're afraid to lose. Beloved, we should be thankful for every good gift that God gives to us. And we should not love anything else, even our own children, to the point where we would be willing to withhold obedience to God in order to protect that thing. We should love the gifts that God has given. And we should know it is a trap to love the things that God has given more than we fear Him. There's a village in India that came up with a trap, that came up with a clever way to trap the feral monkeys who were just out there tormenting little children and stealing food. They were a menace to society. And so what the people in this village would do is they would hollow out one end of a coconut, and then they would place sweet rice inside that coconut, and then they would chain the coconut to the ground. And when a monkey would find that sweet rice in that coconut, they could not help themselves. They would reach in and try to get this treat. But once they closed their hand around the rice, their fist was too big to get out of the hole. And they were trapped. All they had to do to be free was loosen their grip on this thing that they loved. And they would not do it. Will you loosen your grip on your loves? If God is good enough to give you such wonderful gifts that you love so much, is He not good enough to trust with how long He leaves those gifts in your hands? If you believe that He is, that He's that good, I also want to caution you against something. If you're someone who will commit yourself to not waiting whenever you're asked for the unimaginable and not withholding whenever you're asked for the unimaginable, I just want to caution you not to become an Eeyore kind of Christian. Y'all know Eeyore. That character in Winnie the Pooh who can find something to complain about all the time. What I mean is, you should be resolute if you believe in God that you're not going to wait. We've been saved from the futile ways inherited from our forefathers. We're to conduct ourselves with fear throughout the time of our exile. You're resolute to not wait and to not withhold. But don't become hopeless while you do it. And so there's a third thing I want to encourage you with from Abraham's example to us. And that is when God is asking you for the unimaginable, don't worry. Don't worry. And this may be the most unimaginable thing in this whole passage. That Abraham isn't worried. He's not worried. Like, did you pick up on that thing in verse 5? Whenever he's going up the mountain with his son, and he says to his servants, we're going to go on the mountain, me and my son are, and then we're both coming back down. He's not worried. I mean, hear this in verse 8, whenever Isaac asks him, where is the offering, my father? And He says, my son, God is going to provide an offering. He's not worried. I don't think that means that Abraham is skipping up the mountain. I think he's whistling. I'm sure he's troubled. He's troubled, but he's not worried. In Hebrews 11, picks up on our passage and actually explains why it is that Abraham is not worried. So if you're able to keep your place in Genesis 22 and also turn to Hebrews 11, I commend you and encourage you to do that now. Turn to Hebrews 11, and I just want to look at a few verses 17 through 19, to see how it is. Don't you want an answer? Don't you want to be equipped for how it is that if you don't wait and you don't withhold, you can also not worry whenever God is asking you what seems impossible? Here's how Abraham did it. Kind of three steps here. First, he says in verse 17 that Abraham did not disobey God's command. That's the first thing. Don't disobey God's command. Look there in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, he offered up Isaac. He didn't disobey God's command, but then secondly, here's the pattern, he also, at the same time, did not stop believing God's promise. He was able to obey God's command and not let go of God's promise, it says in verses 17 and 18. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This is the son you are to offer up, and that is the son who's going to give you grandchildren. He obeys the command, and he doesn't let go of the promise. Somehow I'm going to offer up my son, and this son is going to give me grandchildren. He goes on to explain this in verse 19. Abraham considered. He's thinking through this, beloved. He considered, God must be able even to raise him from the dead, from which he, figuratively speaking, did receive him back. He was going to offer him up to die, and he didn't die. He got him back from that. Listen to me. If Abraham, the father of the faith, teaches us anything about what it means to have saving faith in God, and that was an understatement, church, the father of faith does lay out for us what it means to have saving faith in God. And this is what he teaches us. Here it is. There is never any conflict between God's commands and God's promises. You need to get this. All of his commands go with all of his promises. You do not have to let go any promises in order to keep any commands. And even hard obedience to commands. Do not forget his promises that he really means. That is what makes sense of what happens now back in Genesis 22 and in verse 5. When he was going up that mountain, and he left his servants behind. This is what Abraham was doing. He was considering, Hebrews 11, he was considering, God has promised to give me a world full of children, as many as there are stars in the sky and sand on the shore. He's going to give me that through Isaac. And at the same time, God has asked me to lay my son on the altar. And God is asking me to be the one to raise the knife high. So that's what I'm going to do. And if the Lord does not provide a substitute before I bring the knife down upon my son, then that must mean he's going to raise my son from the dead. That must be what this means, because he's promised and he's commanded. But we are both coming back down from this mountain. This is absolutely key to not failing the test. Abraham doesn't start worrying about the one he loves because Abraham never stopped worshiping the one he trusts. This is what it means to fear God. It's not about terror. It's not what the fear of God is about. The fear of God is a trembling trust. A trembling trust. It's a trembling because you dare not disobey this God. But fear is also a trust because you love him. And Abraham fears God. He's saying, look, I may not know how all this is going to play out, but I do know him. I do know him. And I'm going to let him worry about me. All I'm worried about is honoring him. And he was totally right to do so. Listen to the urgency in verse 11. Once Abraham does this, the angel of the Lord calls to him and says, Abraham, Abraham. Says it twice, different than the beginning. Abraham, Abraham. He's urgent. And there, Abraham says, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Don't do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And so God provided that ram caught in the bush. Abraham passed his test. And even though Abraham really passed his test, even though we're talking about him now, and what a model he is for us, you should know that Abraham was not high-fiving himself after this happened. And we know that because verse 14 says, this is the way Abraham's thinking about this. Because of this, Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. On the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. So you were to ask Abraham, how is it you still have Isaac? He would say, it's not because of my awesome feats of faith. It's because God gave himself a ram instead of my son. I'm sure you've already guessed, Abraham's unimaginable test is just a foreshadowing. Not of a test that you face, but a test that God faced with his only son. And you know how Jesus Christ is introduced to us in the beginning of the New Testament? In the Gospels, we are told he is the only, as in the one of a kind Son of God. And we are told from heaven itself, in the voice of the Father, this is the one I love. This one. Jesus came not to receive a substitute. Jesus came, beloved, to be our substitute. Can you imagine? None of us came even close to fearing God more than we have loved other things. All of us, I hope you can recognize this. All of us have withheld obedience. All of us still struggle with this worry that God might ask too much, that God might give too little. But look at his son. Look at his only son. And there he is, climbing a mountain not far from this mountain, the mountain of Calvary. And there he is, carrying the wood of his own sacrifice on his own shoulders. And there he is, not struggling, silent, like a lamb before its shearers. There he is, laying his own life down for us. If you're here and you are not someone to this point who has devoted your life to the Lord Jesus, listen. God gave up the one he loves most for a people who did not love him at all. Can you imagine? A son who had never tasted the pleasures that sin promises, and yet he willingly took the penalty that sin demands for the sins you enjoyed. On the cross, saving from the wrath of God and making his people pure. Can you imagine that there is a God and he really does raise the dead? Can you imagine loving the Lord Jesus more because of what he's done and who he is, more than you love father or mother or son or daughter or anything else? Listen, if you will turn from your sins and love him and trust him, he will save you and keep you. If you will do that, or listen, everyone who has already done that, there is a common misunderstanding that I want to just briefly mention. And that is that being a follower of Jesus Christ will make your life easy. Being a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, it will fix the greatest problem in your life. But it will also create for you new problems. Like God himself is going to test you. So that Peter said, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you." When it comes, I want you to remember Genesis 22. And also remember the Princess Bride. I'm over time, but can I just say something about the Princess Bride? Y'all seem happy for that. Buttercup is this beautiful maiden who is testing the lengths that her farm boy would go in order to please her. And so she asks him to clean her horse saddle until she can see her own reflection in it. And you know what the farm boy answered? Wow. I thought we didn't talk in this church. Now, I did all the Jesus stuff already. All right. And then she goes on and she asks him to fill pails of water, and he says, and at some point she realizes that what he was really saying when he said, "as you wish," is, "I love you." I did want you to notice before we're done how Abraham kept answering God. When he called in verse 1, he said, "Here I am." When he called in verse 11, he said, "Here I am." And I would just propose to you that what he's really saying is, "I love you. I trust you, God, and I will do as you wish." And beloved, Abraham did that before God gave his only son. So, the next time God asks you for the unimaginable, will you wait? Will you withhold? Will you worry? Or will you do as he wishes, fully convinced that he who did not withhold his only son never asks more than he's already given?